Hi, everyone. This is Conscious Leaders, a new conscious working series where we talk to leaders and their advisors about the world of work. We'll be covering the essence of leadership and how different management styles have met the challenges of the pandemic and its mass disruption. In it, we examine what's changed in the workplace, new techniques and initiatives designed to support hybrid, as millions attempt to integrate work from home with some office life. Joining me today is Becky Falkingham, CEO of the Alexander Partnership, a leading advisory firm that has been coaching C-suites across some of the biggest businesses in fashion and countless other sectors for decades. Hello, Becky. Thanks for joining.
Hi. Hi, nice to see you.
So obviously we know each other well, full disclosure to everyone. Becky, you were actually my coach. So we were normally talking about me. This time we get to talk more about you. So let's start there with a little bit of your background. You started in retail and strategy consulting. How and why did you transition into executive coaching?
It was a long sort of journey. I loved the strategy consulting, but we got frustrated a lot of the time by providing fantastic strategies for organizations, but the people weren't either ready for the change that it needed, or weren't able to sort of lead the way that it needed to be led. And so that drove me at first actually into headhunting, just looking at talent, and then into coaching. And I love coaching because it's so refreshing, energizing for both them and for me. And every day is different. So every client's different, every situation's different, but you feel like you're sprinkling some magic of positivity and hope and some skills around different organizations and different individuals, and making a difference, which I just love. So it's fun.
And to get into the C-suite, obviously you don't just directly open that door. Was it hard to get into the room?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I've thought about that. My father was a very senior leader, so he ran part of a big multinational food company, and from a very early age I was mixing with very senior people, so I didn't see it as difficult to have a really open and challenging conversation with a very senior chairman, even when I was sort of 20. So from day one I didn't feel uncomfortable. But then when you're in strategy consulting from a stupidly early age, to be really honest, you're sitting in front of CEOs when you're in your 20s and giving them advice, which quite frankly, in retrospect, is a bit crazy. But you're in there already. So you've been given permission by the role you're doing. And then when I was headhunting, I was really focusing on board work. So I was doing CEOs and non-execs and chairmen. So I got to understand boards. I got to sit in boards. I didn't ever run a business until Alexander, but I guess I was part of the boardroom network, if you like, from a fairly early age. So it was a very natural evolution. And so the questions that are on the minds of CEOs and the questions that are being raised in the boardroom have been in my sort of on my agenda from the very, from the beginning, whether it's strategy or leadership or, the talent issues or whatever, as well as the governance of and how it works, because there is quite a difference between how a board works and how an exec team works, and in different sectors. So we have a lot of PE-backed businesses, but we also have a lot of PLC businesses that we work with, and they're all very different, but I've just over time got to know them.
I mean, it's really interesting that actually it's having that comfort obviously means you can probably deliver a lot more. I just wonder though about leadership, because obviously if you're speaking to leaders when you were in your 20s and you're speaking to leaders now, how leadership has changed over the past however many years.
Well, significantly, I think, but well, in some ways not at all. So there are some things that are still common, and actually this does vary dramatically by sector and by organization. So there are still companies that are run quite traditionally, but I guess the best version of a CEO or of leadership in organizations is much more people orientated, is much more driven by the topics you're bringing up, by compassion, by care, by the human factor. So in the old days, if you're really exaggerating, obviously it was a much more command and control, and a much more directive, and a much more distance between the C-suite and the rest of the organization. I think, we've seen it move. We've all seen it move dramatically over the last 20 years, 30 years. I think it's nuanced by company and by individual, though. It's difficult to generalize.
Yeah, but the overarching is that people-focused businesses is where
I think it's a combination of focusing on the people and the human talent, the human factor of the business, but also we'll come on to it, but revealing more of yourself and leading with more of a human side than just as a very formal. It's much more informal, it's much more communicative. Think about all the technology that we've got that we didn't have then. So there's a lot more communication, there's a lot more openness, and actually that's one of the risks for CEOs now, because there was a protection in the way they did it in the old days. Nowadays they're very, very exposed, and as we see with Boris or anybody else, things are happening all the time that they don't really realize are getting out into the public domain.
Yeah, they're under scrutiny all the time, and now Absolutely. Their life is on.
Even in their life, not just in their business life. Yeah.
But let's talk about actually the traits of a good leader and what you're seeing now, and what I know you wrote a piece recently and you talked about compassion. So I'd love to hear about why compassion matters, but also what are some of the other traits that leaders have that actually mean that they are the ones that get the best out of their people.
Yeah, now this is a topic obviously that everybody's written about, and so this is very much off the top of my head, but I think the best leaders show balance. So I can constantly say they're balancing decisiveness with a bit of consensus, authority with understanding others, being very, very human and caring, but actually also quite tough. So the best leaders seem to do both. They're not all one, they're not all any of those things. They're doing it all, and they're juggling it, and they're flexing their style and flexing their abilities and capabilities with everybody. They listen well. They ask questions well. They're curious. They're obviously intelligent. They usually know their industry inside out. They're strategically ambitious, so they're looking beyond the obvious all those things you'd expect. But there's definitely this ability to bring in more of their caring, vulnerability, human sort of reality, if you like, of themselves, but also of their sort of caring of other individuals. And groups of individuals. But I think if I summed it up, it would be about their ability to balance the hard and the soft.
That's really interesting. And I know you wrote something about compassion and bringing compassion into the business. Why does that matter so much more now?
Well, I think the pandemic has made everybody realize on a personal level and a human level that we are all just trying to survive in our own little worlds, and that we've all had a window into each other's lives in a different way, because the stories that we're all revealing to each other and the attitude of each other, of people in their work setting, but has included much more about their personal life, their personal challenges. How are they going to juggle the kids when they're suddenly all working from home, schooling from home? How are they going to connect with their teams in a way that they've not had to, because it's just been so natural when we've been in the office? How are they going to have to think differently about how their teams are struggling? How are they going to look for the signs of stress and the signs of, people not coping? How do we have a conversation about fear and our own personal worries about the pandemic, particularly earlier on when it was really unclear what was going to happen next? So that has opened a conversation for people in the workplace that nobody had nobody had as a norm day to day at all levels, board level down, C-suite level down, to shop floor, and they are doing now. And it's coming from both sides. It's not just senior people asking quite formally, how are you? It's real issues coming up. I mean, there was a lovely, a client of ours, I probably shouldn't say who it is, but a really big client that we'd all know, and we know well. I did a brilliant week in the middle of the second lockdown, probably about a year ago, where they had senior leaders on one day talking about, as a parent, how do I cope at the moment? And they had a massive workshop for they've got 50,000 employees in the UK alone, but they're a global company. But they had all levels coming to this workshop to talk about parenting in this time. And then another day they had one on bereavement, because a lot of people, they happen to have had an exco where I think 5 out of 10 of the exco had lost somebody in the last 18 months, not all because of COVID, but usually related. It was remarkable because I haven't heard quite that many people in one group. But that led to them all having a workshop around bereavement and how do we cope with it and how do we support each other and what does it mean? And then they had another one about young people who are working from home and feeling very isolated. So they had a really practical, but all about the human dynamic and the human sort of challenges that we were all facing at that moment. And I was really impressed, actually, because it was quite quickly off the mark. And they were bang on the right topics.
Yeah, and what's so nice about that is, like, these are all things that all of us will go through, whether you're a leader, whether you're just starting your career, at any point, we all go through these different things that happen in our life that are going to impact us. And before, we could just shut the door, walk into work and pretend they never happened. And now actually employees are craving to be able to share things, but they also want to hear the stories of their leaders.
It was lovely hearing that the very senior, they were picking senior leaders who were willing to open up about it and talk about their own challenges and how they've handled it, and have this sort of conversation in public about their own challenges with it, and which is brilliant.
Yeah. And how did the employees respond to that, and how did the business respond to that? Off the back?
Really positively. I mean, the first couple of sessions, I don't think they had many people join, as in 1,000 or 500 rather than, but by the end they were maxed out. They were in several thousand people coming onto a call to listen to these things. It was really impressive, but it says a lot about that leadership and how open they were willing to be.
Yeah. And let's talk about actually leaders and their response to COVID. So obviously things changed from one day to the next. How did things specifically change for leaders?
That's again a very general question. So different leaders, different situations. So in some sectors, so the airline sector, it went into complete crisis. Like, how are we going to survive this? And it was quite financially based, and it was, there was an element which was, we have to furlough this many people, and there was an operational side of it, but then it became very quickly financial survival, and it has until very recently continued to be in the airlines I know I'm working with. There were retailers that actually were overwhelmed with work, but they were challenged by the fact that the head office were all working from home, but you have the supermarket chains where all the people, everybody else in the chain, the supply chain is working normally, and actually under a lot more stress than usual because there's even more business than usual. And then you've got others like the financial services world where you're trying to run a bank from home. And they were sort of like, this is actually incredible. We actually can run the bank from home. So they were almost surprising themselves, in the first lockdown in particular, how well they managed to sort of cope very quickly, shifting to a place where nobody actually went in the office. There's another angle, which is the boards became quite active. So in those first few months, the companies and the exec teams got into, crisis mode. How do we handle our own personal business issues and our own circumstances? But then you got boards who were normally very formal and coming in, maybe meeting every month or even less than that, wanting to meet every week. And, you know, you can imagine as an exec team, actually, in some ways, that's the last thing you need. And often the non-execs are less experienced at this particular business and in the detail, but they wanted to be in because they didn't want to they wanted to help and they wanted to be involved and they felt responsible. So that was quite a different challenge for some organizations.